I was 9 years old when Libby Powell was taken from her bedroom in the middle of the night. Her family lived across the street from us. That night I was peering through the telescope my father had bought me a few weeks prior to stare at the night sky. Light pollution from the city made it hard to see the stars with the naked eye, but after 3 weeks of peering through the eyepiece I had found a few constellations that were marked in the star chart that had come with the gift. I looked up from the eyepiece for half a second and noticed a dark figure moving toward the side of Libby's house. It looked like an impossibly large man crawling all fours. I couldn't make out any features, but I watched as he reached his massive arm through her window and effortlessly punched through the glass and pulled her out in one fluid motion. Libby was kicking and screaming as I let out a shriek and shouted for my father. It was hard to make out what the man was doing as he pulled Libby into the darkness beside her house, but I could almost swear he was looking right at me. My father came into my room and after calming me down enough to get a coherent answer, he called the police. I told the police everything I just told you. My father and the local authorities treated my statement as being the wild imagination of a scared child, but I know what I saw. For the next week Libby's parents were all over the news asking for the return of their daughter. The media uproar only intensified a week later when Alice Evans was abducted from her bedroom in a similar manner. In the winter of 1991, 7 young girls were abducted from their bedrooms in my neighborhood. I wasn't the only person that reported the impossibly large man, but if anyone had actually bothered to listen to these reports, they weren't being covered by the local news. By March of 1991 the police had announced they had found all 7 bodies in the nearby abandoned Head Start building on Ingram Street. No suspects had been identified. It wasn't long before the rumors started up on the playground at school. All 7 girls had been so mangled the families were forced into closed casket funerals. My little brother Alan was especially scarred. Alice Evans was his girlfriend. They had met in kindergarten and were one of those couples of young children that held hands everywhere they went. When it was confirmed that Alice was dead, he stopped talking. It was a tragedy that turned into a cold case that turned into the trial of the decade when the police had come forward to announce they had arrested William Billy Stout for the murder of all 7 girls. All of the neighborhood kids knew Billy Stout. Billy was born with homocystinuria. Despite being more than 7 feet tall and nearly 20 years old, Billy had the mind of a child. It wasn't uncommon for his parents to bring him to the playground later in the day when most of the younger kids had run home for the day. It was revealed during the trial that one of Billy's shirts and a pair of his shoes had blood on them matching Libby's blood type. DNA testing wasn't really a thing back then. With his connection to Libby's death and the reports of an impossibly large suspect, it wasn't long before a guilty returned a guilty verdict and sentenced Billy to death. I knew Billy. I had even traded baseball cards with him on more than one occasion. I know what Billy looked like. When I started telling people that I had seen the guy who grabbed Libby and that he was much larger than Billy, I was either ignored or told that I was telling tall tales. In the spring of 1994 my dad moved us to a house about a mile away from our old neighborhood. Alan had to withdraw from school. Not only had he stopped talking, but he had also started lashing out at anyone who tried to talk to him. The head shrinkers up at the hospital had put him on a series of pills that left him staring out the windows most days. Dad had to hire a full-time caretaker for Alan. 3 years after Libby's abduction and Billy's trial I was still convinced that there was some giant monster out there stealing kids. I had probably read every book in the local library on ghosts, monsters, and serial killers. I was in 7th grade and most of the kids had started calling me Spooky. Despite being the weird kid everyone thought was a devil worshipper or some sort of freak, I had made a few friends. Stephanie Powell shared my opinion on Billy Stout. She had been in the room when her twin sister was snatched from the window. She had a sketchbook filled with drawings of the dark figure that had taken her other half. She and I had started spending time with each other in 5th grade and by junior high we were pretty much best friends. She introduced me to Deont Jackson. Deont had lost his little sister as well. The 3 of us ate near the back of the cafeteria. We spent most of our time after school at the library. Dion and I lived a few blocks from each other. Stephanie still lived across the street from my old house. Each day at around 6 or 7 in the evening, Dion and I would walk Stephanie home before walking the mile or so to my new neighborhood. It was somewhere around early May when he stopped in the middle of the sidewalk and said, "Hey Spooky, look." He was pointing at a small patch of trees and brush to the side of a house on the corner. At first I couldn't make out what he was pointing at. The sun was already low in the sky, and behind us. Dion pointed at the patch of trees, and just as he darted past me I caught sight of the shadowy figure standing just inside the small wooded area. It must have been 10 feet tall. As Dion ran past me, the dark figure dropped down onto all fours and ran across the street into an alley. I followed him as he chased the shadowy man through the dark alley. He must have walked down that street a few hundred times and never noticed that alley before. It was long and narrow. There were chain link fences and garages on either side of us as we dodged trash cans and tried to catch up with something that had already disappeared into the darkness. We were quickly approaching at the end of the narrow path. At the end of the alley was a near monolithic stone wall. It must have been 20 feet tall. On either side was a similar stone wall that stood nearly as tall, stretching nearly 40 feet back. As we stood in the alley, barely wide enough for a small car, we turned around to see an impossibly large man standing between us and the last bit of the sun dropping below the horizon. The contrast of the orange-red sun against his near pitch-black skin showed exactly how large he really was. His eyes were a deep blue and his mouth had opened to show near perfect white teeth that looked as if they had been sharpened into tiny daggers. Dion and I realized very quickly that this thing wasn't running from us, it was baiting us into following it. Each step it took toward us was slow and deliberate. Our backs were against the wall. The dark man lowered his face to the point that he was staring directly into my eyes. His tongue extended and I started crying as he licked my cheek. His expression turned to one of frustration before he turned toward Dion and sniffed his chest. The creature recoiled, seemingly in disgust, before planting one foot on the concrete wall to my left and proceeded to climb over the concrete wall and into the darkness behind it. We didn't wait to see if it would return. The two of us ran out of the alley and back to my house without looking back once. My dad was working late and Becky, Alan's caretaker, had been nice enough to hand us a couple of sodas from the fridge as we spent the rest of the evening trying to make sense of what we had seen while taking turns talking to Stephanie on the phone. By the time my dad had come home, Dion and I had passed out on the floor of the living room. On Saturday morning the three of us waited until the sun was high in the sky before making our way to that alley. Unbeknownst to the other two, I had taken a small pistol and an extra magazine from my father's gun cabinet. We turned into the alley to the right of the patch of trees and quickly came to realize that it led out into the street onto the other side of the block. We walked up and down the alley 3 or 4 times before scouring the rest of the neighborhood looking to see if we could find anything like the stone hallway the dark man had cornered us in. Nothing. Unable to return to the end of the alley, we turned our attention to the small patch of trees where we had originally seen the creature. Just past the tree line we found a raised mound of dirt that seemed to be hiding a 5.5 foot wide hole in the ground. I wasn't about to climb down into it, and I don't think either of the others were so inclined. Instead, I threw a rock into the hole. I heard it bounce off the sides a few times, before making a sound like it had plopped into a pool of water. Dion said, "Avert your eyes, Steph, this thing took Andrea and I'm gonna piss on it." Stephanie turned away as he proceeded to take a leak directly into the mouth of the hole. Just like with the rock, heard the piss hitting what sounded like water at the bottom. However, no sooner than Dion had zipped his pants, we heard a bellowing roar come from somewhere deep in the chasm, followed by loud scraping sounds. We bolted, and just as we cleared the edge of the trees I looked back to see a pitch black arm with a massive black hand swipe in our general direction. We had found its lair. You'd think that we'd have found a way to plug the hole or convinced some adults to do something about it, but 3 years of trying to convince people that the dark man existed in the first place had taught us that no one was going to believe us. Instead of trying our hand at spelunking, we went back to the library and spent the rest of the day looking for anything we could find that would tell us more about the Dark Man. I spent most of the afternoon in the paranormal section of the adult library. I sat at a table flipping through books on ghosts, cryptids, and various local legends. Dion and Stephanie had disappeared at some point and left me to my reading. I had become used to the idea that they had probably slipped into a reading room or something to make out. They had been dating for a few months at that point. The librarian walked up to my table and said, "Francis, we're gonna be closing up in a few. You might wanna head home." The library closed early on Saturday. I stepped outside to see Dion and Stephanie sitting snuggled up next to each other on a bench listening to Stephanie's Walkman and sharing the headphones. It was 6 in the afternoon and the sun was still fairly high in the sky, but we were more than 2 miles from home and the bus had stopped running a few minutes prior. I had an uneasy feeling about walking home. I turned to Stephanie and said, "Do you think we could call your parents to come pick us up?" Stephanie shook her head before saying, "My dad hates Dion, I'd just as soon call the police and told them I stole something." Dion laughed and said, "Yeah, dude hates me, but we can call my cousin Q." We walked to a nearby payphone and I dropped a quarter in the slot as Dion picked up the receiver and called Q. A few minutes later a teenager in a station wagon pulled up and said, "Yo Dion, who's the chick?" Dion punched me in the arm and said, "Oh, you mean Spooky here?" "Nah, he's a guy, I think." Q laughed and said, "Stop clownin', dude. Now where am I taking y'all?" I climbed into the front seat with Q and Dion climbed into the back with Stephanie. Q was Dion's older cousin. He lived with Dion and their grandmother not too far from my place. I reached into my bag to pull out my water bottle and Q tapped me on the shoulder whispering, "Yo kid, why are you packing heat?" I looked down in the bag and saw that the pistol was in plain view. I turned to Q and said, "Man, you don't wanna know." We pulled into Q's driveway and he turned around to say, "D, go introduce Grams to your girl. I'm gonna talk with Spooky for a minute." "Alright little man, why are you running around with that pistol?" Q asked in a concerned tone. I stared out the window and replied, "Do you know why they call me Spooky?" Q replied, "Yeah, because you're always going on about ghosts and shit." I laughed uncomfortably and said, "No, it's because I watched the thing that stole Dee's sister grab Libby Powell. It wasn't Billy Stout." Q's tone changed to one of anger and he raised his voice slightly and said, "Don't be putting any of that ghost story shit on Andrea. I hope that fucking retard burns in hell for what he did." I turned to Q and stared directly into his eyes as I said, "The thing looks like a man, but his skin is as black as midnight and he stands almost 10 feet tall. You think I'm fucking around?" asked Dion. He saw it too. Q visibly shuddered and said, "I can see why they call you Spooky." I continued, "We know where that thing is and as soon as I see it again I'm going to shoot it. Don't tell D or Steph either. They don't know about my dad's gun and I'm not telling them." Q pulled a cigarette from a pack in his shirt pocket and offered it to me saying, "You smoke?" I lied and said, "Sure." He lit the cigarette and handed it to me before lighting one for himself. 13 years of living with an indoor smoker and I didn't even cough when I first inhaled the cool menthol of the cigarette. By the second drag I was already feeling kinda dizzy, but I liked it. I smoked the cigarette and stared out the windshield in silence as Q and I shared that moment. After nearly 5 minutes of silence Q said, "You should talk to my Grams about that tall dark dude. Sounds like a story she used to tell us." I got out of the car and went inside to see that Dion's grandmother had already set out a feast for us. Stephanie and Grams were chatting with each other about Dion as Q came in behind me. Grams said, "I can smell that smoke on you, Quentin Marcus Jackson. You better wash your hands before you touch this food." I joined him at the sink and washed my hands as well. I didn't want to risk getting on her bad side. Q pulled up a chair and Dion said grace as we all sat around the table. Stephanie had called her parents saying she was at my house. My dad probably wouldn't be home in time to notice I had stayed out late. We ate and talked over dinner until Grams told Q to take Stephanie home and sent Deont upstairs to shower and get ready for bed. I helped her clear the table as she said, "So what were you and Q talking about outside?" He looked like he had seen a ghost. I didn't answer. Grams put the last dish from the table up on the counter before saying, "Y'all shouldn't be running around this town at night. It's dangerous out there." I laughed and said, "You have no idea." Grams got a look on her face that was halfway between stern and afraid when she said, "Try me, kid." For the next hour I told her about Libby, the dark man, the end of the alley that wasn't really there, and how we had found a hole it seemed to be hiding in. Grams didn't say much, but she also wasn't telling me I was crazy or making things up. It was nice to have an adult that was actually listening to me for once. As Grams sat there and listened, Deont came downstairs in his pajamas and posted up next to his grandmother. She turned to her grandson and said, "So y'all ran into him, huh?" Deont nodded and Grams reached into her purse and pulled out a small metal flask. After taking a swig, she coughed and said, "Y'all need to listen close. It might save your life." When I was about Q's age, everyone was upset about Russians dropping atom bombs. The folks up in the city council got the idea that they were gonna build a tunnel that connected a bunch of fallout shelters under the city. That old Head Start building used to be an elementary school. One of the shelters was built right there in the basement. My husband Percy worked on the digging crew. He'd come home telling me stories about how they had tunneled from the elementary school all the way to the train depot over on 3rd Avenue. Then one day people stopped worrying about bombs and the city stopped working on the tunnel. Percy got a job with the city working on the roads. The shelters were still there. The tunnel was still open. People just didn't much care for it anymore. That is of course until they found all the bodies. Grams paused for a moment and continued, "We had been telling the police for weeks that someone had been going around snatching up our kids, but back then no one really cared what happened to a bunch of colored children. It was only when the mayor's daughter went missing that the police started looking into it. 3 more white kids went missing in a week and one of the mothers described a tall black man running off into the elementary school. The police searched every inch of that building and when they found nothing, they went down into the basement and found the door to the tunnel standing wide open. Less than an hour later they were calling in every available officer. They had found 15 kids torn to shreds in the fallout shelter. Some of them looked like they had been there for months. One of them, the last girl to be taken, was still breathing when they found her. She pointed into the tunnel and let out a little whimper of a scream before passing away right then and there. Grams took another swig of her flask and coughed again before she adjusted herself in her seat and leaned forward. The police didn't waste any time rounding up every tall black man in the city looking for someone to pin the murders on. They eventually settled on Alton Park. Alton was kinda slow, but he was also the janitor at the school. His trial lasted less than a day and he was sentenced to hang. He was dead within the week. Beatrice Stone outside the courthouse screaming to anyone who would listen about how Alton was innocent. She screamed that he wasn't tall enough and how the man who took her daughter had skin as black as pitch, not brown like me or Q. She spent the next few years in a sanitarium before her family finally brought her home. I think she's still up in Spring Haven nursing home to this day. She doesn't talk anymore. People say she just sits there and stares at the window. I was more than a little stunned by her story, but something wasn't sitting right with me. I paused for a moment after she finished and said, "How is this gonna save our lives?" Graham sighed and said, "I was getting to that, son." I gripped my backpack a little tighter as she said, about 10 years later some kids went missing. Once again they were found in that elementary school. Once again they pinned it on someone slow. We knew the cops weren't gonna help us, so when it came time for the winter about 10 years later we all took shifts watching our kids. Q's mother was around 5 or 6 back then. Percy was sitting in the bedroom with our oldest son James taking turns staring out the window and holding the shotgun. Mabel, Q's mother, and her brother Ozzy were in bed when the creature came. Percy said it almost looked like a shadow at first. Jesse was holding the shotgun and fired directly into its chest. It let out a blood-curdling howl. Jesse and Mabel screamed and went to the floor. The creature reached in and grabbed James by the arm and threw him into the wall hard enough to knock him out cold. Percy went for the gun and was already bringing it up when I reached in and grabbed Jesse. Mabel was sitting there on the floor when that damned thing poked its head down and sniffed her before turning and looking at Jesse. He reached for him just in time for Percy to reload the shotgun and fire a spray of buckshot directly into the thing's face. It howled as it jumped out of the window and into the night. Grams took the flask and passed it to Dion saying "Drink up son. You too Francis." Dion took a swig and gagged before passing it to me. I took a sip and felt it burning as it slid down my throat. Grams took her flask back and said, "Jesse was the sweetest little boy you'd ever met. Mabel was a little troublemaker though. After talking to Ethel Pearson at church, we heard how her twin girls were sleeping in the same bed when it took one and left the other. She cursed under her breath and said that she watched it look away from the surviving girl in disgust. Apparently the leftover girl had just been caught stealing from her mother's purse that day." Dion interrupted and said, "It only takes the good kids, right?" Grams patted Dion on the head and said, "That's my smart boy. Now don't go and set a church on fire or anything, but make sure you do at least one thing every day that would get you in trouble if you got caught." I skipped church the next day and walked up to Spring Haven. After showing the nurse at the front desk my Bible and claiming that I had come up to minister to the elderly, she let me in with a smile. Grams had said the woman's name was Beatrice Stone. I walked the hallways for a bit, stopping in a few rooms to talk about Jesus so as not to raise any suspicion before seeing the name B. Stone outside of a room and finding an elderly woman sitting in a chair staring out the window. I sat down next to her and opened my Bible saying "Mrs. Stone, my name is Francis Colley." She didn't so much as blink in response. I continued, "I know this is gonna sound strange, but I have a question for you about the thing that took your daughter." Her face shifted to a stern expression and her eyes shot toward my direction while her face remained in the general direction of the window. "Did it have blue eyes?" I said as I realized I was being more than a little inconsiderate for perhaps the first time that morning. Beatrice coughed and said in a quiet voice, "His teeth were like knives." She turned to me and said, "How did you get close enough to see it, boy?" I told her about the alley and how it had licked me. She grabbed me by the wrist and said, "Why do you get to live when my baby died? What makes you so special?" I didn't have an answer for her beyond what Grams had said the night before. I stammered out the words, "It only takes the good kids." The elderly woman jumped from her chair and pummeled me with a quickness I had not expected from a woman pushing 80. I screamed in pain as she raked her nails across my face. As the orderlies were pulling me off of her, she screamed, "If it won't kill you, I will." I had to call my dad up to the nursing home and fed him a line about how I was evangelizing to the sick and elderly when the woman attacked me. I showed up at school the next day with stitches on my forehead and cheek. Dion asked what happened and I lied saying I got into a fight with a high schooler. He laughed and said, "Yeah, and last night I plowed Cindy Crawford." We both laughed and went to class. Stephanie was waiting for us outside after the bell rang at 3. When the school bus pulled onto my street, there were police cars everywhere. We all stepped off a bit early as the bus backed off of my street and took an alternate route. The closer I got to my house, the more I started to feel the sickness in the pit of my stomach. My worst fears were realized when I saw that the window to Alan's room had been obliterated. Becky, the caretaker, sat on the back of an ambulance as paramedics bandaged her hands and face. My father was shouting at the police only to stop mid-sentence and run over to me. He picked me up into the kind of hug I hadn't experienced since kindergarten. He held me and cried as he said, "We're gonna find your brother, okay? He put me down and I pushed past him and into the house. No one seemed all that interested in my room and I dumped the books out of my backpack before stuffing with road flares, a flashlight, the gun I had stolen from Dad's safe, and some extra batteries. I stormed outside and marched up to the nearest cop saying, "You know damned well my brother is gonna end up in that fucking preschool. Just grab some men and go down there already." The officer shot me an annoyed look and said, "You should watch your language, kid." I looked up at him and said, "Fuck you. If you aren't gonna do anything to save Alan then I will." He turned back to his colleagues and I started off down the road as Deont and Stephanie followed me asking where I was going. It didn't eat the bad kids. Alan was kicked out of school for beating up other students. It didn't grab him because it was hungry. I knew beyond knowing that it grabbed him to punish us for bothering it. As I approached the abandoned Head Start building, Deont stopped me in my tracks and said, "Damn it Francis, stop." I stopped and he continued, "What do you think you are going to do to that thing?" I pulled the gun from my bag and pulled back the slide before saying, "I'm going to fucking kill it." Deont and Stephanie took a step back before Stephanie said, "Do you have another one of those?" I shook my head and she said, "Well, what do you have?" I passed out the flashlight and a few road flares and we made our way into the abandoned preschool. Most of the glass on the doors had been busted out years before I was born. The city had boarded the place up, but there was a small window that still had glass and that's where we broke in. Once we were inside, the smell hit us immediately. The whole building smelled like raw sewage. Stephanie coughed and said, "We should probably follow the smell." I nodded and in a few minutes we found a doorway leading down into what looked like a basement. Stephanie turned on the flashlight and I took point as we moved down the stairs. We walked across the basement and toward the open hole in the wall that led to the tunnel. A heavy iron door lay rusted on the ground directly across from us. I could hear a quiet whimpering from inside. We rushed inside and that's when the flashlight caught Alan's leg just above us. The thing had impaled him on a piece of rebar that had been bent down from the crumbling concrete ceiling. Alan whimpered some more as if he hadn't even noticed us. Deont dropped a road flare in the tunnel behind us. It gave off a hiss before giving us a bit more light to work with. Alan was too high up for any of us to pull him down. I turned to Stephanie and said, "Run upstairs and get help." She nodded and turned to go when we saw it. The creature stood in the red light of the flare. It was covered in a slimy liquid and had to crouch in the tunnel. It leaned on its long arms and smiled as stared directly at me. Deont popped another road flare and held it in front of him as I pulled the pistol and proceeded to empty the magazine into its torso. I immediately realized my mistake. None of us had brought earplugs and the deafening sound of the gunshots left us disoriented and unable to hear each other. The creature shook off the bullets and grabbed Stephanie by the face with its massive hand. Before I could load the next magazine into the gun, I was hit by the creature as it used Stephanie as a flail and knocked me to the ground. Deont pushed the flare into creature's arm and it recoiled in pain before closing its hand into a fist and punching him so hard that his head looked like it had been crushed with a sledgehammer. With one friend dead at my feet and another being used as a weapon to pummel me into the ground, I had all but resigned myself to the fact that I was going to die. As I laid there broken, the creature laughed and said, "There's no such thing as heroes, kid," in a voice that sounded like someone was playing recording of James Earl Jones through a speaker made of gravel. It held onto Stephanie as it moved deeper into the tunnel, laughing the whole time. I couldn't move. My arms and legs were useless. Slowly but surely, the road flare burned out. I laid there watching Alan whimper until the flashlight started to dim. As the last of the light left the crumbling fallout shelter, I noticed that my little brother had gone completely still. Left alone in the darkness, I eventually passed out. My father says that the police found me and Alan after about a day of searching. I woke up in the hospital in a full body cast. They never found Stephanie. Deont's body was laid to rest a few days later. I wasn't able to make it to the funeral. It wasn't long before the city filled the tunnel with concrete. I have no idea if the dark man was inside, but given that kids still go missing in that town every 10 or so years, I'm going to assume it found a new place to set up shop. After I was well enough to walk on my own, my dad took a job in a neighboring state and we moved. I'm pushing 40 these days and I have a few kids of my own. It might sound strange, but as soon as they were old enough to know the difference between right and wrong, I encouraged them to do bad things every now and then. It might not make me the best parent in the world, but then again nothing has ever tried to snatch them up. It only eats the good kids, but it has no problem killing the bad ones. I still have no idea why it left me alive.